Joining us right now, the director of the Korea Working Group at Harvard's Belfer Center, who previously worked at Goldman Sachs' M&A Advisory Group, Dr. John Park. Dr. Park, good to see you this morning. Thanks for joining us.
My pleasure.
So in addition to the North Korea summit, investors are also watching crucial policy meetings from the Federal Reserve and the European Central Bank. First, your reaction to the summit. What are you expecting in terms of next steps here?
Sure. In terms of next steps, there's a tendency in the North Korean analysis field to do a single event analysis. An event happens reading the tea leaves. But I think it's important to widen the aperture and put this summit into context. There is, right now, in parallel, 3 potential mechanisms that could be running forward. And so with that, you have to look at it at the Singapore summit as a beginning of the crucial one. And this is a denuclearization mechanism. President Trump referred to it as the beginning of a process. Once we see movement on this denuclearization process, it creates a political space for the South Koreans to move forward on their permanent peace mechanism and also this idea of the large inter-Korean economic development and commercial projects. So from that sense, I think the outcomes, we're not going to see the immediate type of effect, but it has set off this type of series of events that I think net positive going forward. We're going to see the type of reactions in the South Korean marketplace in particular that's going to receive the news from Singapore very warmly.
John, it's Dakin McDowell. Can you branch out and apply to what is happening with North Korea and apply it to, there's a lot on the president's plate in terms of NAFTA negotiations. There's a NATO meeting coming up this summer. Again, we're going to have to deal with Iran and potentially negotiating a new nuclear deal. Can you apply any success the United States has with North Korea to all of these other negotiations that are on the docket?
Well, that is the part that I think is going to be interesting in terms of transferability of what has been effective so far. You know, clearly the bilateral approach has led to something that, from President Trump's perspective, led to this breakthrough. And in many respects, this direct type of engagement in an unprecedented way was helpful. But one of the key things that we've seen with different types of deals in the past, implementation is really multilateral. And so that's an area, if there's a learning curve aspect, the idea of working with partners in a different perspective in this multilateral setting is going to be crucial. Implementation on a bilateral basis is somewhat unprecedented. So from that perspective, the idea of catalysts politically in a bilateral sense, but then figuring out how to work within a group of countries and lead that group of countries, empower the group of countries to work towards implementation, that's going to be the big question mark going forward.
Do you worry that the president said that the U.S. is stopping the war games? That's the military exercises between the U.S. and South Korea. You know, Gordon Chang made the point earlier, readiness is so critical, and if we stop the military exercises, we won't be ready, should we need to be. So what's your take on that?
Well, clearly there are downsides, and with respect to what Gordon mentioned there, the South Korean military is a conscript military. It's mandatory military service. It's a little over 12 months. So they essentially have one shot at doing this type of interoperability and also this exercise with their American allies on the ground in the Korean Peninsula in South Korea. However, this is the idea of using the incentive of suspending military exercises to get more forward movement from the North Korean side. And this is a big part of the security guarantee that President Trump mentioned, and that's embedded in this document that he signed with Chairman Kim in Singapore. So the idea is, what can he get for this gesture, this incentive? And this is a key part of looking at what North Korea is going to do on the denuclearization front. So the bar is high, and I think this idea of doing a lot in the beginning and try to get this process robustly underway is a top priority.
You know, Lindsay Bell here, just when I look at the market's reactions, really been pretty muted all week, you know, coming out of the G7 over the weekend, and then now this huge historic summit with North Korea. And then you have lying in the balance China. When I think about trade, it really has been what has weighed on the markets for the majority of this year. And in my viewpoint, it really creates sort of a cloud over the market, prevents it from going significantly higher. How do you view trade going forward, and as it with regards to the markets? Sorry.
Sure. You know, specifically with respect to China, I think it's this broader concept of how the Chinese view some kind of transparency. I think it's difficult for the Chinese right now to see what comes in the second and third steps. They're focusing on the immediate step because that's directly in reaction to what they're seeing from the U.S. side. ZTE is a classic case. You see the Trump administration dial back the punitive measures against ZTE in terms of restrictions, $1 billion fine, ZTE having to come more into compliance along U.S. standards here. And then what we saw with this bipartisan effort coming out of the Senate, essentially embedding some of those restrictions back in place and having that all within the context of the National Defense Authorization Act. So this is a part of the transparency aspect that for the Chinese, it's causing a lot of angst. But with respect to the broader trade dynamics here, there's a lot of drama going on. And I think with respect to what's happened in the Singapore summit, it's been muted because of the larger overhang of this drama in the different areas, what happened with G7 and so forth.
Right, and the president mentioned it. He was asked about all the trade tensions while in Singapore. Here's what he said. Listen to this.
I had a very good meeting with the G7, and I left the meeting, and I'll be honest, we are being taken advantage of by virtually every one of those countries, very, very seriously. Now, the United States, because of bad management at the top, because of presidents that didn't care about trade or didn't understand it or whatever reason, for many years, with China being obviously the most successful at it, but the European Union is second, 151 billion we lost. They were represented at the meeting. And we're being taken advantage of on trade.
What do you think about that? IMF Managing Director Christine Lagarde says that the clouds over the global economy are, quote, getting darker by the day. Do you agree with that?
Well, there's a lot of change. I think what President Trump is trying to do there, shaking things up, this idea that the European side, G7 has to do more. All of these things are happening in a short period of time. You know, this idea of reform, change, that's been on the books for a while. But the idea of gradually introducing these modifications was a part of the playbook in the past.
Right.
But the key thing here is this idea of getting the G7 and EU members also to increase in the military budget and spending side of things. So there are a lot of core issues that are interlinked right now, and how these issues are managed going forward, that's a part of the game plan that I think everyone's waiting to see. Real
quick, before you go, John, your take on the Federal Reserve. You think they're going to raise interest rates tomorrow, and then you got the ECB on Thursday?
So the indications, it looks like there is going to be a quarter-point rate increase by the Fed, and this idea of a little more tightening. This whole idea of a couple of more anticipated ones ahead, if it's idea of the beginning of the plateauing after that, that's a part where I think Chairman Powell and the communication to the marketplace will be critical. With the ECB, the idea of tightening also, but then the overhang of what's happening with Italy. So this combination of the political risk aspect of it, we're seeing that rise in a way that we haven't seen in the past before.
All right, we will leave it there. Dr. John Park, good to see you, sir. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
We will see you soon.